right, how about a big round of applause for Eric Call?
It's the elongated Moth I do own a chainsaw. Do I get any points for that? Anything? No? All right. I was a little distraught when my girlfriend finally convinced me that I have no scars worth talking about. Thanks, hun. So I did what any grown man would do. I picked up the phone and I called my mother and asked her, "Do you have any good stories about scars, Mom?" And I guess I shouldn't have been surprised when she reacted the way she did, because she's never really told me much about her childhood. And her first response was, "Oh no, dear. I lived a very protected childhood." That could very well be true. But after thinking about it for a minute, something clicked, and she started to tell me the story of her father, my grandfather, who had a very prominent scar on his right hand. Now, my mother's German, so she was born in 1934 in Czechoslovakia, and she was the only child of Oscar and Mary Guschel. So every picture that I have of her as a little child, she's blonde-haired, blue-eyed. She's wearing the traditional German lederhosen. I mean, she's adorable. She looks just like Heidi. But her dad, who's in the same pictures, Oscar, was a very stern, very serious man, seemingly never smiled. But the man that my mother told me about was not this same guy. Oscar Guschel was an artist. He was a musician. He played the violin beautifully, she said. And by trade, he was a jeweler and a watchmaker. And his hands, my mother said, were magical. He could do anything with them. Now, the town that they lived in was a part of Czechoslovakia that was occupied and inhabited by ethnic Germans, and so it was this part of Czechoslovakia that Hitler decided, I think I'll annex this in March of 1939, I think it was. And so my mother very carefully describes this time as being not all that bad. Overnight, crime goes away, the town is clean, and people are seemingly happy. But of course, it's not long before Oscar, her dad, is drafted himself into the German army. Now, fortunately, because he had very talented hands, his assignment was pretty cushy. His job was to maintain the instrumentation panels of all the Luftwaffe planes, and he was assigned to an airfield in the Bordeaux region of France. Tough job. And in his spare time, he managed to make toys by hand for the neighborhood children in France, and they were very happy about that. And the best toys, of course, went home with him when he had leave to his darling daughter, my mother, Gerda. Now, of course, the tide of the war, as we all know, changed in 1944, and the Germans started to beat a hasty retreat from France. And it was during this retreat that my grandfather, Oscar, finds himself in the back of a truck that's being strafed by an Allied dive bomber. And so as he's heading over the side of the truck, the wedding ring on the middle finger of his right hand gets caught on something on the truck. And the ring manages to peel back most of the skin from his middle finger, and it mangled the rest of the fingers on his hand. So the wound is patched. It never really heals completely. And by the time he gets sent home to Mary and Gerda, 3 of his fingers are useless on his right hand. Now, by all rights, he should have felt very lucky to be alive, and I suppose he was happy to be home with his family. But my mother's most vivid memory of this time was the day that Oscar took his precious violin and he slammed it down on the table. And he had found something that his magical fingers couldn't do anymore, and he never played again. And so the story could have stopped right there. But it was like something had opened up from my mother, a door, and she was not going to let it close. So for the next hour, I learned more about Gerda Gushel, little Gerda Gushel, than I had ever heard in the last 44 years of my life. She told the story of how Oscar was actually redrafted, quickly captured. He spent a year in a POW camp, and while he was there, he managed to learn how to hold a pencil with his remaining 2 good fingers, and he did these amazingly detailed, impossibly perfect sketches of his home, all from memory. And she told the story of how she and her mother were driven from their home by the Russian army as they came through that part of Czechoslovakia, and how they lost everything, and they spent a year in a work camp. And she told the story of how they were reunited finally when they were smuggled into West Germany in the back of a truck underneath potato sacks. And I'm trying to absorb all this new information. And she says to me, this little voice on the other end of the phone, "So, Eric, do you think there's anything in there that you could use?" And I said to her, "Protected childhood, my ass."